Amongst the 1,000 or so chapters of Space Marines, one stands alone in terms of zeal, faith in the God Emperor, and pure fighting strength. I'm Philip from Manning the Fort, and today I'll be covering more about the Black Templars. With a new Codex supplement, refreshed minis, and some recent tournament success, the Templars are becoming more popular than ever. My aim with this video is to provide a high-level overview for those new to the Templars, as well as hopefully provide some tidbits for veterans who want to incorporate more lore into their armies. So let's get into it. The story of the Black Templars begins during the time when the Emperor of Man still walked and fought alongside the Adeptus Astartes, the Space Marines. The 7th Legion of Astartes was the Imperial Fists, led by their Primarch, Rogel Dorn. The most elite warriors of the Imperial Fists were known as the Templar Brethren. As the name suggests, they were tasked with guarding the Temple of Oaths. In battle, they wore distinctive black and white cross heraldry that should be very familiar to even the most casual Black Templars fan. The greatest fighter amongst the Imperial Fists, and arguably amongst all the Space Marines, was Sigismund, who became first captain of the Templar Brethren and the favored son of Rogel Dorn. After the Horus Heresy, Dorn resisted the decree of the Codex Astartes written by his fellow Primarch Robute Guilliman that the legions were to be divided into chapters of 1,000 Marines each, a tiny fraction of a legion's full strength. Dorn was so intransigent on the point that it almost led to a second civil war while the Imperium was still reeling from Horus's betrayal. Eventually, Dorn relented and agreed to have his remaining sons divided into chapters. He chose Sigismund to lead one of those new formations, the Black Templars. The Templars are unique from most other chapters in many ways, but one of them is their organization. At the head of the Black Templars is the High Marshal. In many ways, he serves a similar role that a chapter master would to other Space Marines. Despite having a central figurehead, however, the Templars tend to have a rather decentralized command structure. Where a Codex-compliant chapter is organized into 10 companies with various roles, the Black Templar structure is more ad hoc, being made up of Crusades with specific goals. Most Crusades are led by a Marshal, who, much like the captains of other chapters, are given a great deal of autonomy in how to prosecute their goals. How many Crusades are ongoing at any given time can vary pretty widely. At one point, it was said that there were always at least 3 underway, but the various codexes and other bits of lore through the years seem to indicate that there are typically a lot more than that. 3 current Crusades are detailed in the new Codex supplement, and it's noted that there are several others currently underway. The size of a Crusade can vary pretty widely. In the Forges of Mars series, we hear about a single squad of Marines led by a chaplain. On the other hand, the Heimdall Crusade, described in the new supplement, is massive. Its numbers aren't described in detail, but it's said there are 5 fighting companies and more than 150 vehicles along. When a crusade needs to further divide its forces to accomplish multiple tasks at once, a fighting company is formed. That fighting company can also vary widely in size and is led by a Castellan. They are the rough equivalent to lieutenants in other chapters. This leads me to the next peculiarity about the Black Templars. Their chapter itself is huge. The lore has been inconsistent at times with this, but the prevailing implication is that the chapter is much bigger than the 1,000 or so Marines that the Codex Astartes dictates. At various points, it's been implied that there could be more than 5 times that many Templars, and the recent addition of Primaris reinforcements probably pushes that number even higher. The vast size has occasionally been justified by saying that the rule of 1,000 Marines doesn't apply to a chapter on an active crusade. The Templars consider themselves permanently on crusade, so they can disregard that rule and be technically correct, which of course is the best kind of correct. In other places, like the 4th edition Codex though, it's heavily implied that they simply don't care, and basically dare the Ordo Astartes of the Inquisition to come start a ruckus. Based on the account of the conversation between the current High Marshal, Helbrecht, and Robute Guilliman in the new supplement, it seems that Guilliman isn't particularly bothered about it for the moment either. Like with Crusades, the squad composition amongst the Black Templars is ad hoc, and more based on the desire of Marines to fight alongside each other than anything else. Also unusual for the chapter is that the neophytes, scouts, in most other chapters fight alongside fully fledged Marines within the same squad, very much in the manner similar to a knight and a squire. That brings me to how the rest of the chapter hierarchy works and how the Templars replenish their absurdly high numbers. The Black Templars are a fleet-based chapter. They don't have a single homeworld like some other Space Marines. Rather, they travel the stars on their various crusades and set up chapter keeps on different worlds as they go. These worlds are where potential brothers are selected. This covers a broad variety of planets, but there is evidence in the lore that the Black Templars like to select candidates from harsh worlds with warrior cultures. The strongest and most capable of a planet's youth will be taken by the Marines as aspirants, just like with other chapters. Youth matters, since the extensive genetic manipulation and augmentation surgeries required to become a Space Marine cannot be performed on someone who's too old. It's during this time that an aspirant will slowly begin to be transformed into an Astartes in both body and mind. In addition to the gene therapies and implantation of organs that turn a human into a Space Marine, they'll undergo extensive psycho-indoctrination. In recent years, it's become much more explicit that this indoctrination includes being made a fanatical zealot for the Imperial Church. It hasn't always been that way, but that's a discussion for another video. Once an aspirant has undergone most of the transformation on the way to becoming a Space Marine, they'll rise to the rank of neophyte. In most chapters, this means being assigned to a dedicated scout company to complete their training. Within the Black Templars, however, each neophyte is selected by a full battle brother, an initiate, who becomes the neophyte's mentor. Like I said earlier, that neophyte will then effectively act as a squire to the Marine, including fighting alongside them in battle. As you might imagine, this can lead to a pretty high casualty rate, as the scout companies for other chapters are often used in more stealth-oriented missions, rather than being thrown straight into the meat grinder of battle. Once the neophyte is deemed ready by their mentor, they'll receive the final implant, the Black Carapace, which allows Space Marines to interface with their power armor, and will be raised to the rank of Initiate. Veteran status amongst the Black Templars works differently from other chapters as well. Like with neophytes, the most proven warriors of the chapter are not formed into a single company. Rather, the marshal of a given crusade will appoint them to the ranks of the Sword Brethren. Sword Brethren form a marshal's household elite troops and perform a variety of functions. They can form squads with one another when a concentration of their centuries of skill and experience is needed, or they can elect to lead a squad of initiates and neophytes into battle. It's also from the Sword Brethren that the Castellans are chosen when needed. Castellan isn't necessarily a permanent rank, though. When the need for a fighting company is ended, the Castellan goes back to being a Sword Brother again. Finally, when the Marshal of a Crusade dies, it will likely be one of his Sword Brothers who takes up the mantle. I want to take a moment here to talk about how heraldry and color variations on armor work within the Black Templars, as it's easily one of the most common questions I see from those new to the army. I'll start by saying that the Templars, by their very nature, are not big on complying with rules imposed by others, judging from their blatant disregard for the Codex Astartes. Therefore, anyone telling you that there is one way to paint your Templars in order to be correct is probably a secret Ultramarine. That said, guidelines can be helpful for someone starting out, so take these as exactly that and nothing more. What I'll lay out for you is some of the general tendencies, bearing in mind that these have shifted through various codices and supplements. While we did get a basic look at the Templars way back in 3rd edition, it wasn't until our codex in 4th that we got a more comprehensive look. Personally, I still use a variation of this for my Templars army. The real differentiation tends to come from the shoulder pads. In the 4th edition version, the majority of Marines have the iconic white shoulder pad with black trim. The red trim is meant for assault squads, though the pictures from the same codex also apply it to biker units as well. I take this a little more broadly and tend to apply it to most fast attack choices in general, as well as some dedicated assault specialists. Fast forwarding to the current guidelines, battle line and fire support units get the black trim, while close assault units get red. The second version of the 8th edition Space Marine Codex spells out exactly what's meant by close assault. It includes Reavers, Incursors, Assault Squads, Bikers, Assault Centurions, Inceptors, and Suppressors. Most of these make sense, but suppressors seem like a bit of an odd choice to me. They feel a lot more like fire support since they have long-range heavy weapons. But if you want to follow the guidelines as written, they'd get red trim. I have seen some say that Crusader squads with close combat weapons should have red trim in order to be correct. Aside from my resistance to there being a correct way in the first place, I think every version of the guidelines would suggest otherwise. The idea of our Crusaders and Primaris Crusaders is to be the equivalent of tactical and intercessor squads for other chapters. They're not necessarily close combat specialists, they just brought their chainswords instead of their bolters to battle that day. From a practical standpoint, painting them with red trim could very well result in few, if any, units in a Templar's army having the black and white shoulder pads they're known for, since we do tend to lean into close combat and veteran units. Sword Brethren get black shoulders with a red cross. I play all my veteran units as Sword Brethren, so things like Vanguard vets, Terminators, Blade Guard veterans, and of course, the actual Sword Brethren squad. I also tend to paint up all my squad sergeants as Sword Brethren, both for my personal lore preferences and to help distinguish them on the table, though that is not a requirement. One thing that should be noted is that the new supplement gives room to paint Sword Brethren with the standard black and white shoulders and still be quote-unquote lore-friendly. The idea is that the Marine eschews personal glory from changing his heraldry and reserves all glory for the God Emperor, or something. My personal theory is that this is to give Games Workshop cover for having painted the Black Templars version of the Blade Guard from the Indomitus previews with black and white shoulders, but if you prefer it that way, hey, there's lore support for it now. Then we have specialist characters, namely Apothecaries and Tech Marines. In most Marine armies, Apothecaries get painted mostly white, and Tech Marines mostly red. I regularly see questions about whether the Templar versions of these would be painted in the same way or in black armor. The answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, is whichever you prefer. There is an Apothecary pictured in the 4th edition Codex wearing black armor with a white shoulder pad and helmet, but there's also one described in Hell's Reach as wearing white, like they would in other chapters. The Tech Marine in the 4th edition Codex has red armor, but here's an official piece of art from the Deathwatch role-playing game of a Black Templar's Tech Marine in black armor. My personal preference is for white and red armor respectively, but that's largely to break up the all-black look that a Templar's army can pretty easily fall into. I was going to include a discussion of various Crusades from the history of the Black Templars, but a lot of my subscribers told me they prefer videos that fall in the 10 to 20 minute range, so I'll save those for another video. If you want to see that when it comes out, you can subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. What I do want to make sure I get to is some of the more recent Templars history and where it puts the chapter in the current lore. First, we have Armageddon. It may be strange for older players to think of the Third War for Armageddon as recent, since it happened about 20 years ago in the real world, but in lore terms, it wasn't that long ago, and almost any veteran Templar would have been alive for it. It comes from a time when Games Workshop was trying to cram as much as they could into the lore without really advancing the timeline at all. As a result, it largely takes place within the last year or two of the 41st millennium. This war is the backdrop for the majority of books focusing on the Templars, including Conquest for Armageddon, Crusade for Armageddon, Hell's Reach, Blood and Fire, and Eternal Crusader. The accompanying Codex Armageddon is where the Templars first got their own rules. To make a long story very short, the Black Templars were one of the Space Marine chapters that deployed significant numbers to help the world of Armageddon repel the Orc war boss Ghazghkull Mag Uruk Thraka. Templars were deployed all across the planet, most famously at Hive Hell's Reach, where Reclusiarch Grimaldus and his forces rallied the city's defenders to victory in what was initially considered a lost cause. The Hell's Reach Crusade also provides a great example of a crusade that isn't led by a marshal. While marshals are the norm, they are not an absolute. Another interesting facet from the Third War from Armageddon is the Templars' wider role beyond the planetary war itself. The Black Templars often get pigeonholed into being a little more than Khorne berserkers in black armor, charging straight into the enemy and hacking away. Armageddon shows us that isn't true, as High Marshal Helbrecht is given overall control of the naval battle. That's because, as a fleet-based chapter, the Templars are experts at naval warfare, and Helbrecht in particular is a very skilled strategist and leader. One of the major crusades of the Black Templars that doesn't get as much attention is the actions of Marshal Amalric in his Crusades crusade during the 13th Black Crusade. As with each of Abaddon the Despoiler's forays into the Imperium, the Templars were there to meet him. The main reason this is somewhat less known than the exploits of, say, Grimaldus is that it was never novelized. Rather, the story is told in the 3 campaign books leading up to the fall of Cadia. In the telling, Amalric is a somewhat stereotypical Black Templar. He's stubborn, pious, and filled with righteous zeal. Still, some pretty unusual things happen, including the forces of the Templars fighting alongside the Eldari, albeit very grudgingly. In addition, Marshal Amalric himself is at one point given the mantle of Emperor's Champion. If there's another instance of a Marshal becoming Emperor's Champion, I must have missed it. Amalric is right there with Castellan Creed in the final days of Cadia, and accompanies Belisarius Cawl and Inquisitor Greyfax on the quest to Macragge to revive Robute Guilliman. It would be really interesting to see this story novelized. I don't know if it ever will, because things get pretty weird with Cypher showing up with some Eldar Harlequins and all sorts of other shenanigans that feel shoehorned to get other factions involved in the story. In the end, Amalric lives up to the mantle of Emperor's Champion, impaling his black sword deep into the chest of the massively powerful Demon of Khorne, Skarbrand. The most recent Codex supplement has given us some context into the actions of the Black Templars in current 40k lore. I do have another video going over some of those lore tidbits, but I'll summarize briefly here. We know that High Marshal Helbrecht has met with Robute Guilliman and embraced the new Primaris Marines. Helbrecht compromises with Guilliman over his pursuit of Ghazghkull Thraka after Armageddon. The chase will continue, but Helbrecht agrees to form several new crusades in order to defend various worlds belonging to the Ecclesiarchy, the Imperial Church. Also, Guilliman doesn't seem to bat an eye at the size of the Templars. With the desperate state of the Imperium, a mini legion of superhuman soldiers fanatically loyal to the Emperor may be just what the Doctor ordered. The supplement also gives us a few glimpses of the Templars fighting all across the galaxy. We have that large crusade accompanying the Second Indomitus fleet that I mentioned earlier. We also know of at least one crusade seeking a lost black sword from an Emperor's Champion, and another fighting against Necrons on a mining world. Beyond that, we know from sources like the book Spear of the Emperor that there are Black Templars continuing to aid the Celestial Lions chapter, who were betrayed and almost wiped out by elements of the Inquisition during and after Armageddon. Between the size of the chapter and the ad hoc nature of crusades and organization, a Black Templars player could reasonably have their forces fighting pretty much anywhere against pretty much anyone. Games Workshop always tries to make it feasible for tabletop battles to happen in the lore, but it often feels shoehorned. This time though, I don't feel the need to suspend my disbelief as much against just about anyone. Heck, I even played another Templars player in a narrative game and didn't have to do too many mental gymnastics to square it in my head. Like I said at the top, this is meant to be a high-level introduction to help people who want to play Black Templars on the table get a bit of a handle on how they differ from other Space Marine chapters and a little bit of their history. There is a lot more material out there, so I want to hit up some of that before I wrap things up. Here are a few recommendations for further reading. If you happen to be a veteran of Templars lore and have further suggestions to add, feel free to do so in the comments, but I think these provide a pretty decent starting point. First, we have the most well-known piece of Templars lore, Hell's Reach. This follows Reclusiarch Grimaldus through his experiences on Armageddon. There is a great animation out there, but I recommend checking out the whole book if all you've seen is the YouTube version. The book is about 5 times longer than the movie and has some really good stuff that had to be left on the cutting room floor. Then there's Blood and Fire. One of my very first videos on this channel was talking about how this novella is my favorite piece of Black Templars lore. It's a continuation of Grimaldus' story on Armageddon, so it's best if you read it after Hell's Reach. Damnation Crusade is a graphic novel. It does a good job depicting the various stages of a Black Templar's journey in the chapter from aspirant to sword brother, and the art is pretty sick. Tancred endures. Finally, we have a book that is more recent than all the others, but takes place earlier chronologically. Black Legion is part 2 of a series by the same name, and covers the build-up to the First Black Crusade. While it focuses mostly on the forces of chaos, the Templars do play a significant role, and it's just rather well written. If you're interested in more lore about the first High Marshal, Sigismund, I have a couple other videos going into a deeper dive on that. The first of those should be on screen now. If you stuck with me this long, I'd really appreciate it if you liked the video and subscribe to the channel. It's grown faster so far than I ever could have imagined, and I hope to continue improving the quality of videos on both the lore and the hobby side of Warhammer 40k. Until next time, suffer not the unclean to live, and thanks for watching.